Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Lil Dudes Insect Academy podcast. Wait, before we get started, I just wanted to say thank you for tuning into this episode of the Lil Dudes Insect Academy podcast, and just ask you to please hit the like button below or click the subscribe button if you're watching on YouTube, or follow this podcast if you are listening. That really helps the show out. But also, if you want to help us further, then join our Patreon. We have an awesome community that is growing there. Or if you want to make a one-time donation, we are a nonprofit foundation, so head to our website. Both the Patreon and the website will be linked down below. But without further ado, back to the episode. I am here at the ESA conference in Washington, D.C. this week, and I'm sitting across the table from my new friend Tyler. So welcome to the show, Tyler. I'm so excited to talk with you about all your work, and I'm excited to get to know you a little better together. So welcome to the show, Tyler. Go ahead and introduce yourself for us.
Well, thanks for having me on the show here, Bradon. I'm excited to be here. So my name is Dr. Tyler Wist. I work for Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, and of course that's in Canada from working for the federal government there. And I'm a field crop entomologist, so that means I'm chasing bugs through fields with a net on a pretty regular basis, or at least having somebody do that for me.
Nice, yeah, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a minute, but let's take a step back and talk about your schooling. Where did you go to school for all of your degrees, and what was that kind of like, and what was some of the research that you did in school?
Okay, so I started in my undergrad at the University of Saskatchewan.
Okay.
And in my second year of university, that's when I started tailoring things towards entomology.
Right.
So I took as many of the entomology classes as I could fit into my schedule, including beekeeping, which kind of comes up later on in my academic journey. So in my beekeeping class, I took that in my last year of undergrad.
Nice.
And was doing really well. And the professor took notes, and I was sitting up at the front of the class because, I enjoyed the class. So I was sitting at the front of the bus, right?
Yeah.
And also up at the front of the class was Dr. Davis's master's student. And he said, hey, I think you should talk to Art Davis about doing a master's project with him. And I figured, I don't think I learned enough in my undergrad about insects. I want to know more.
Right.
So that's how I got into the master's program with Dr. Davis. And so got a scholarship through the department. And what I had to do, of course, was teach as well. So doing lab demonstrating, and worked on my master's degree for about 2.5, 3 years. And I call that my bugs and flowers phase.
Nice.
So I was looking at pollination of a specialty crop at that time called echinacea. So echinacea was being grown for its potential therapeutic benefits in treating colds.
Okay.
And I said, well, this is really cool, but what pollinates it? So it's it's kind of like sunflower. It's got a big inflorescence with a bunch of small flowers in it. And so each of those small flowers has to get pollinated so we get a seed so that you can get the medicinal compounds out of it. And so if you take one of those little seeds and you bite them, you actually get this weird stinging sensation on your tongue.
Weird.
And so I think it was like a Native American painkiller at some point.
Interesting.
Yeah. So after the master's degree, I got called a botanist way too much.
Yeah.
I said, no, I identify as an entomologist.
Yeah.
Not a botanist.
Right.
But I was working on things like palynology, so looking at the pollen of the echinacea, and I was looking at nectar as well, so nectar dynamics. And so I guess it was just a natural thing to call me a plant scientist at that point.
Right.
So I said, nah, all right. So then I went back to where I was working before. We had this big outbreak of insects on the trees in my hometown. And I said, I want to figure out how to stop this.
Yeah.
So found a lab down the road at the University of Alberta.
Okay.
And got an NSERC scholarship from the federal government.
Nice.
And well, that actually came out of my master's project, where the echinacea that I was working on was getting pollinated by these two really cool insects. One was called a bee fly, the other was called a blister beetle. You wouldn't think that a beetle would be a good pollinator,
Right.
But this blister beetle, when we put it under the scanning electron microscope, you can see it had hairs all over its body. And
Right.
it carried pollen, just like any other thing would. And
Yeah.
it liked to just crawl around on those florets of echinacea. And it did a pretty good job pollinating.
Wow.
The bee flies were a little faster. Boom, they came in, they drank their nectar, they ran around a bit, and off they went. But the common thing between those two insects was in their larval stage, they're grasshopper egg predators. And we had a big grasshopper outbreak. Boom, there was 2 striped grasshoppers everywhere.
Yeah.
So many that they were eating the marking tape right off my echinacea plants.
Wow.
But you know what they weren't doing? They weren't eating the echinacea. So I said, have we got a plant here that prevents grasshoppers, like the grasshoppers didn't want to eat it.
Right.
And then we've got the pollinators that are feeding on it are grasshopper egg predators. And I said, well, here's kind of like a 1-2 punch against grasshoppers, because they hatch on the roadside and they move into a crop. So I said, what if we had a crop on the outside of your typical crop of echinacea? The grasshoppers won't eat it. They need to feed right away. Maybe they won't move through it.
Right.
And then it can also produce these nice pollinators that are going to eat the grasshopper eggs in their larval form. So I got a scholarship to study that, and then didn't study that.
Yeah. Nice. Yeah. So that was your doctorate, right?
That was leading into it. So
Yeah.
I went down the road to a lab that was studying this ash leaf cone roller moth. And they were looking at things like pheromonal attraction to traps. And so they were able to catch all sorts of males on the pheromone traps. But the females don't come to a pheromone trap, of course. And those are the ones that are laying eggs, which then lead to damage on the trees. And so I was working on a chiromonal cue. So I was basically trying to duplicate the smell of an ash tree and get the moths to come to it.
Okay.
And it worked in the lab.
Yeah.
We put it out in the field.
Yep.
And I think it just was lost in the smells
Yeah.
out there.
Too much distractions. Yeah.
Too much distraction. But what I also started working on during this PhD were these little parasitic wasps that were coming in and stinging these caterpillars, and found out that they were actually doing a really good job population control.
Interesting.
So that caterpillar is not booming anymore, I think because it's being controlled by these parasitic wasps. So
Yeah.
that led into my next job as a postdoc and then research scientist.
Yeah. So did we introduce more of those parasitic wasps, or how did that population of the caterpillars, go down?
Bradon, that's a great question. So you're talking about classical biological control and maybe even inundative biological control, where you're taking that biological control agent, the little parasitic wasp, and you're bringing it into an environment.
Right.
This thing, though, was already there. And so one of the research questions that we had all the way through my PhD is, well, where did this wasp come from? What's it hopping off of to go onto this ash leaf cone roller? And we were looking in the literature, and there was a few other like caterpillar hosts on different trees, though. And so that said, yeah, this little parasitic wasp will be in these ones. And then we're like, okay, well, how does the parasitic wasp survive the winter? And then a grad student in the lab, after I'd already left, she found the overwintering host of this parasitic wasp. So we're like, hey, we're just, tying everything together now. So that was really exciting. And we're trying to work on a paper together to describe that situation.
Wow, that's fascinating. Yeah. So now moving on to your postdoc, what was that like, and what did you do for that?
So the postdoc was, we kind of came out of, I ran out of money in my PhD.
Right. Yeah.
5 years of guaranteed funding ran out, and I was still writing my thesis. And then I got offered a part-time job with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada with Dr. Christelle Olivier and Owen Olford. And they had this project looking at predators of cereal aphids. So they said, we've got a bunch of these sweep samples that we took in 2012, and we want to know what they all are. Can you identify these? And I said, yeah, I'll do that. So I sat down and started identifying all these beneficial insects and the aphids that they were eating. And then the next step was to create a dynamic action threshold. So You got this action threshold for aphids, which is about 12 to 15 aphids on average on a head of wheat.
Okay.
And so that's your threshold. So you say, okay, I got this many. It's going to start causing damage in my field. I'm going to spray it now.
Right.
So that's kind of how we employ these economic thresholds. But a dynamic action threshold takes into account the action of the beneficial insects in the field. So maybe we don't have to spray if we're getting up to this, near this economic threshold, but we got a lot of lady beetles in the field, and those are eating the aphids.
Right.
Maybe we've got a lot of green lacewing larvae, which are fantastic, unless they bite your hand.
Yeah.
Then it stings a little bit.
Yeah.
That was a super fun day. And so that led into a bit more on some insects that we were finding in these sweep samples. So 2012 was a big year for a disease called aster yellows.
Okay.
And it affects canola production. So
Right.
aster yellows is a phytoplasma, gets into the canola plant and just messes it up. So in a lot of cases, you get zero yield out of an infected plant. And in 2012, we had all these sweeps from the wheat fields, and they were full of the vector insect, which is called an aster leafhopper, that was transmitting aster yellows. And the canola was full of aster yellows that year.
Right.
And so then that led into a project with Christelle on looking at aster yellows. And we looked at it in wheat and in camelina and in canola. And then one day I defended my PhD, and the next day she said, well, you better start as a postdoc. And here we go.
Wow.
And that led into the career with field crop insects.
Amazing. Yeah. So what you're doing now is sort of similar to what you did for your postdoc, right?
Yeah.
It's the surveillance of the. Tell us a little bit about more about that.
Yeah, so if we're surveilling insects in a field, I think the best way to catch them is with a sweep net.
Yeah.
So you got your standard diameter sweep net. It's 15 inches in diameter. You drag it through the field at a 180-degree sweep, and that is one sampling unit. So usually we do that at least 10 times on a bit of a transect as you're going through the field. And you dump that out or you freeze it so the insects are easier to count when they're not moving anymore.
Yes.
And then we figure out these dynamic things like how many pests do we have? How many beneficial insects do we have in the field? And then the next big question with those aster leafhoppers was, okay, how many aster leafhoppers do we have to have? And how infected are they before
Right.
we need to think about controlling them to stop the spread of aster yellows?
Right.
And so oftentimes what we were finding in year to year to year is that the aster leafhoppers were not very infected with aster yellows. So they'd come in and they'd be infected at less than 1% on sort of a population-wide scale. But then every once in a while, we get years like that 2012 year where they're infected at more like 10%. So you get a lot of leafhoppers with a lot of infection, then you get a lot of plants that get infected. And so I've spent the last, say, 6 years trying to understand the dynamics of those things.
Right.
But I was also hired to work on wheat, which the aster leafhopper gets into. And there's a pest called wheat midge. And so
Okay.
back in the 1990s, we had this huge outbreak of wheat midge. And Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada threw a lot of scientists at it to learn everything like what was parasitizing it, could the parasitoid control the populations,
Right.
what are our economic thresholds, how does this thing even survive? And we found just some very cool things. So what I'm doing now is built on the shoulders of these giants in science who came before me.
Yeah. Wow. That's so much there. But let's move on to a little bit more about you. When did you originally get into and interested in entomology? Like, was there a specific point, or were you kind of always into it?
No, definitely there was a specific point that led me onto this trajectory.
Yeah.
So I was in my second year of university, maybe end of my first year, and I needed a job for the summers.
Right.
So I applied with my local municipality, and they said, "Oh, you're studying biology, and you've got a background in horticulture," because I was working at a tree nursery for a couple of years.
Okay.
And they said, "We're going to put you into a program called Pest Management." And I said, "I didn't even know we had a program like that." So
Yeah.
the Pest Management department was involved in mosquito control. So
Okay.
I got big into mosquito control, really started to enjoy that. And we were doing trapping of the mosquitoes with light traps and then identifying the mosquitoes. And I thought, oh, this is this is really cool. And so
Yeah.
that's where I kind of started getting into the dynamics of these populations.
Right.
So, and we were also out there looking at trees. So we were looking at the insects that were affecting the trees. We had this huge outbreak of this box elder leaf roller. So you would look down the tree line, so big canopies in town, mostly American elm, but every once in a while, there's a Manitoba maple with no leaves on it. So you could just say, that's a Manitoba maple, because it's been completely eaten by these leaf rollers.
Wow. Yeah.
And so that was probably my first introduction to these booms of insects that could have such a detrimental impact on single plants, but also like all the plants in the landscape.
Yeah.
So I remember a Star Phoenix cartoon where it said, "Welcome to Saskatoon," and it was being spelled out by these leaf rollers that drop down on silken lines. And so nobody likes having leaf rollers in their hair while they're walking under this nice canopy of plants.
Yeah.
So that, and then looking at Dutch elm disease as well, which is a disease spread to those American elms by little bark beetles. So we're doing bark beetle trapping using pheromones and chiromonal lures, which is duplicating the smell of a bark beetle, but also the smell of the trees. And you put those together, and it makes a really powerful lure. So that was probably my first introduction to using pheromonal lures. And so I just thought this job was the coolest summer job ever.
That is awesome. Yeah, that is a really cool job. Yeah. So what are some of the other activities that you enjoy in your spare time? You've done a lot of work in entomology, but these hobbies can be, related or unrelated to entomology. But what are some other things that you enjoy in your spare time?
Well, I've got 3 daughters, so I enjoy raising them.
Yeah.
Enjoy hanging out with my wife too.
Nice.
And I play some soccer still. So I grew up playing soccer. I also grew up wrestling, but that's pretty tough on the body to keep going.
Yeah.
When you get to be my age. And I also enjoy coaching. So I've coached all 3 of my daughters in soccer.
Oh, nice. That's
And
awesome.
So right now I'm coaching an under 11 girls soccer team, which
Very
my
cool.
youngest daughter's playing on. So I
Nice.
enjoy that quite a bit. Coaching with the Aurora Soccer Club. So go Aurora.
Nice. That's awesome. Well, good for you. Yeah. So, what are your big plans and aspirations for the future? Where could you see your work going, and what's the big plan?
Interesting question. Okay,
Yeah.
so my big plan, whenever I think about a research project, I think, what is the end use? How practical is this? And how is it going to benefit the farmers in my community?
Yeah.
Because those are the end users of my project. So if I
Yeah.
can't come up with a way to say, this project could have good impact on the farmers, then there's really no point putting that project forward for grant funding or consideration.
Right.
So with the wheat midge, we're trying to find some resistance mechanisms, so plant resistance mechanisms, so working with the plant breeders. And I'm building that program on some huge successes. Back in the 1990s, after that big outbreak, they actually found a genetic region in this winter wheat that made the seeds of wheat that were tapped into by these wheat midge larvae, made them unpalatable. And so the larvae they're like, I don't like the taste of this. They stop feeding. And then because they're teeny tiny, they don't really have legs. They just sit there and starve to death, which is great. And so now we've got about 35 varieties of this midge-tolerant wheat that we use in Canada that kills the wheat midge larvae.
Interesting.
Yeah, super cool. But there's one resistance gene, and some of the wheat midge can survive on it. So we're trying to protect that single mode of resistance. If the wheat midge population overcomes that, we're back to trouble again.
Yeah. Wow, that is super fascinating. How about any trips or any other things like that you would want to do?
Trips that I would want to do. Well, a friend of mine at the University of BC said, hey, you should come to my wheat meeting. And I said, I should come to a national wheat meeting working on wheat insect pests. He's like, come talk about wheat midge. So I'm actually going to Vancouver next week. And so that's a trip that I'm looking forward to. So come to the ESA meetings, and it's all entomology. So I can learn about this bug or that bug.
Yeah.
But it's such a big meeting that I feel like I've missed 99% of it. With this national wheat meeting, there's no concurrent sessions. It's just one person talking. so I can sit there and I can just learn all about wheat
Yeah.
breeding, wheat diseases, a few things on wheat insects. I guess I'll be doing most of the teaching on the wheat insects.
Yeah.
So I'm looking forward to just sort of a smaller conference where I can focus just on one crop.
Nice. Yeah. Yeah. And speaking of this meeting, what are you doing here at ESA this year? Did you have any talks to go to or give, or were you just hanging out for the week?
Yeah, I got invited to a symposium on wheat insects. So they wanted a bit of a Canadian perspective.
Yeah.
So they said, hey, Tyler, can you talk about this wheat midge problem
Yeah.
and the response of the Canadians to it? And then my colleague, Haley Catton, she was talking about cereal leaf beetle, which is another
Nice.
wheat pest. And so
Yeah.
we talked about those two things. But during the wheat symposium, I got to listen to people working on wheat down in like Nebraska, Colorado,
Right.
up through these Great Plain regions,
Yeah.
which are donor populations for the insect problems that we have up in
Right.
Canada for some of these migratory insect pests, like
Yeah.
cereal aphids and also the aster leafhoppers.
Yeah.
So it was just eye-opening saying, okay, so your crop is senescing at this point in time, and then I see problems up in Canada, like literally that same week. So I think, there's our driver for migration of these insect pests.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, that's really awesome. There's a crazy amount of people here, and like you said, the breadth at which people, the kind of people here, is just like the diversity of people here is just unreal.
Yes.
Like anything from medical to agricultural, like yourself, to forensic. Even it's just crazy the amount.
Forensic's pretty exciting.
Yeah, the amount of people here and the variety of people here is just unreal. Like it's absolutely crazy. I've interviewed everyone you can think of, like every industry. So it's really awesome. Yeah.
Nice.
So
I'm glad you're having a great time here.
yes, I am. Yes. Yeah. So lastly, before we wrap this up, Tyler, where can we go to learn more about what you've done and what you're working on? Like if you have social media or a website or something like that that you can share with us. Yeah. Where can we go to learn more?
That's interesting. Yeah. So I'm on, I guess it's X now.
Yeah.
At Tyler Wist 1.
Yep.
So my profile there says, I'm just going to talk about insects and maybe wheat. So
Nice.
that's usually what I post on there.
Yeah.
I'd be on Instagram as well. So what I found really interesting with Instagram was you can make short little insect videos and then put them to music.
Yeah.
So I started doing that.
That's
I had a
awesome.
praying mantis. And so I think the first video, I had a praying mantis, and she had taken it upon herself to eat the head off of her male counterpart.
Yeah.
And so I got the video right down to the point where she popped his head off.
Nice.
And I put that to music, Nazareth, Love Hurts. And so right at the part where they sing, ooh, ooh, love hurts, the head pops off.
Nice.
And I was like, I'm sold on this
That's
making
awesome.
video thing.
Yeah, that sounds like fun. Yeah, so I'll leave the links to those down below in the show notes of this episode as well, so you guys can go check that out. But thank you so much for being on the show, Tyler. This was super fun. Great to get to know you. I can tell you're super passionate about this and always have been. But yeah, thank you so much for talking with me.
You're welcome, Bradon. Thank you for having me on your show, and appreciate Lil Dudes Insect Academy.
Thank you. I'm glad. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Lil Dudes Insect Academy podcast. If you enjoyed it, definitely consider dropping a follow on whatever platform you're listening on. And also, Lil Dudes Insect Academy is a nonprofit organization. So if you're passionate about science communication, entomology, outreach, and education, and you enjoy what we're doing and how we're solving that gap, then consider heading over to our website and donating there, or becoming a monthly donor via our Patreon, which is also linked in the show notes of this episode. Yeah, so share this episode with one of your friends, and tune in next week. I will see you all next week, and with that, keep on bugging.